You call this war? The voice rang sharp through the Grand Assembly Hall, cutting through the layered murmurs of alien diplomats like a blade scraping against steel. Admiral Sorik Tal, his 6-foot frame of coiled muscle and glistening exoskeletal plating, strode toward the center of the chamber. His secondary arms folded behind his back, while his primary hands gestured toward the massive projection above. The display flickered, casting distorted light over the faces of the gathered species. The Battle of Balaclava unraveled in grainy, preserved footage, cavalrymen in tattered uniforms charging into artillery fire, the ground swallowing bodies beneath exploding shells. The scene shifted, men storming the beaches of Normandy, their figures torn apart by relentless machine gun fire. Another cut blackened fields of World War I, a choking haze of toxic gas swallowing entire battalions. Sorik Tal exhaled from his slit-like nostrils, his plated brow ridge rippling in mock amusement. "What madness is this?" he continued, arms sweeping grandly. "You call yourselves warriors, your species throws flesh against iron, bone against fire. There is no honor in this. It is not strategy, it is desperation, a child's flailing before the inevitable." Laughter bubbled up from the assembled council members. Some alien forms flickered with bioluminescent amusement. Others rumbled deep in their thoraxes, a sound like grinding stone. The towering council leader, Dren Mavic, draped in the ceremonial robes of his species, leaned forward from his high podium. "Ambassador Voss," he mused, his voice textured like rolling gravel, "you have remained silent while your kind is stripped bare before us. Do you dispute these truths?" From the delegation's platform, Grant Voss lifted his head. His eyes, cold as tempered steel, reflected the burning footage still flickering above. The air held the scent of polished metal, of ancient stone warmed under artificial lighting. "No," Voss said simply, his voice measured. "You are right. We have sent men to their deaths. We have fought with desperation. We have made mistakes. But that is not the whole story." The silence that followed was different from before, not the silence of amusement, but of uncertainty. The council members watched him now, their initial condescension tempered by the weight in his words. Sorik Tal scoffed, his mandibles clicking. "Then enlighten us, ambassador. Educate us on the brilliance of throwing men into slaughter." Voss stood slowly, his posture meticulous, his movements controlled. He stepped forward, the soles of his boots pressing firm against the cold floor, each step reverberating in the quiet chamber. "You misunderstand war," he said, his tone neither defensive nor pleading. "You judge it by the strength of weapons alone. That is your first mistake." The chamber's ambient lighting dimmed as the projection above shifted. The footage now displayed ancient earth stone walls under siege, legions maneuvering in perfect formation, empires clashing with swords and shields under crimson skies. Voss tilted his head slightly, observing the expectant faces before him. "Let me ask you," he continued, his voice steady as iron, "how many of you have fought a war in the last 2 centuries? A few raised appendages, some metallic limbs clicking, a few translucent tendrils undulating in response. 1,000 years, more, 10,000, now the room stirred. Almost all raised their equivalents of hands. Voss let the question settle, his gaze trailing across the room like a silent predator, assessing its prey. "And how many of you have fought a war against an enemy you knew nothing about?" A pause. No hands, no tendrils, no motion. Dren Mavic tilted his head slightly, his molten gold eyes narrowing. Voss nodded, his expression unreadable. "You all wage war under familiar conditions, against species who think like you, who fight like you, who abide by the same rules." He took another step forward, hands clasped behind his back. "Humanity has never had that luxury." The projection flickered again, this time the Battle of Cannae, where an outnumbered Carthaginian army encircled and annihilated the Roman legions, turning superior numbers into a liability. The scene shifted to World War II, Allied forces feeding false intelligence to the Axis, convincing them of attacks that never came. The air in the hall felt heavier now. The laughter had stopped entirely. Sorik Tal shifted his stance, arms folding across his chest. "So you rely on deception, the tactics of the weak." Voss's gaze snapped to him. "No," a single word, but it carried weight. He raised a single finger. We rely on understanding the enemy better than they understand themselves. War is not fought with ships and guns. War is fought with thought, with misdirection, with preparation. The projection blinked once more, this time into the future. The orbital campaign of Europa Prime, the first interstellar war humanity ever fought, a war where human forces, outgunned and technologically inferior, dismantled a superior enemy through unpredictability alone. Some council members leaned forward slightly, their expressions shifting from amusement to contemplation. Voss turned, leveling his stare at them. You think war is about brute force, you think it is about firepower, but humanity has never been the strongest, or the fastest, or the most advanced. The images of past conflicts faded from the screen, leaving only the cold, expectant glow of the chamber lights. Voss let the silence linger, let the weight of the moment settle into the bones of every being in the room. Then at last he spoke. We are the most unpredictable. A murmur swept through the chamber. It was not laughter, not mockery, but something different, a creeping realization. Dren Mavic's expression, once placid, had darkened into something thoughtful. He folded his clawed hands beneath his chin. Intriguing words, Ambassador. He leaned forward slightly, but words mean little when war demands action. Before Voss could respond, an alert blared through the chamber, sharp and urgent. The main display flickered, then stabilized, revealing a transmission from a distant sector. A cold, unreadable voice spilled into the room. This is High Command. We have a situation. The Evok Dominion has launched a full-scale invasion. The Council erupted in confusion, alien dignitaries turning to one another, their voices a discordant flood of disbelief. Sorik Tal's mandibles snapped open in alarm. Voss, however, remained utterly still. Dren Mavic turned sharply toward him, his expression unreadable. Ambassador, I assume this is as much a surprise to you as it is to us. Voss glanced down at the data projection on his wrist. The information wasn't new to him. He exhaled once. No, he answered simply. Mavic's brows knit. No, Voss lifted his gaze. Because humanity already saw this war coming. A heavy silence gripped the chamber, thick and suffocating like a storm rolling in before the first crack of thunder. The Grand Assembly, once a theater of mockery, had transformed into a stage of uncertainty. The words still hung in the air, words Voss had spoken with neither boast nor hesitation. Humanity already saw this war coming. A ripple of shifting bodies moved through the crowd. Councilors exchanged uncertain glances, their bioluminescent displays flickering in muted confusion. Others twitched appendages, mandibles clicking, nostrils flaring, sensory spines rising in unreadable tension. No laughter remained. Chancellor Dren Mavic's molten gold eyes narrowed, fingers interlaced as he studied Voss. Explain. Voss exhaled slow and measured, like a man waiting for the tide to pull back before stepping forward. The Evok Dominion's expansion has followed a pattern, one that was obvious to anyone who cared to look. Every 10 cycles, they probe new territories, test defensive thresholds, analyze response times. When the Council did nothing, they took it as confirmation of weakness. His gaze swept the room, pinning each delegate beneath its weight. They weren't wrong. A murmur spread through the chamber, growing into a discordant blend of unease and unspoken admissions. The Council in all its grandeur had spent centuries coddled by stability, its wars little more than ceremonial skirmishes fought with predictable tactics and comfortable rules. But war, true war, had never been predictable. It had never been safe. Admiral Sorik Tal shifted on his feet, his heavy frame casting a looming shadow across the council floor. And yet he drawled, voice tempered steel, humanity, one of the most war-torn species in recorded history, chose to do nothing. His mandibles clicked once sharply. That does not align with the narrative you've woven thus far, Ambassador. Voss lifted a brow. I never said we did nothing. Before the Admiral could reply, the chamber's central display shifted. A war map unfurled across the room, its pulsating markers stretching over entire star systems. The Evok fleet moved in orchestrated precision, their offensive a slow but inevitable tide, consuming everything in its wake. But beside the crimson glow of their incursion was something else. Pale blue markers, positioned at seemingly innocuous points along their trajectory. Dren Mabek's head tilted ever so slightly. "What am I looking at?" Voss clasped his hands behind his back. "Contingencies." The silence thickened. "They've been gathering for years," he continued, voice even. "Shadow fleets, auxiliary forces, sensor ghosts seeded into their systems so deep they believe the falsified data more than their own intelligence. The Evok think they're attacking a stagnant force." His lips barely shifted, yet the air carried the razor edge of amusement. "They're not." Sorik Tal's pupils dilated, his secondary arms twitching in restrained unease. "You're telling us you prepared for a war before we even declared one?" Voss finally turned, facing him fully. "No, Admiral." His voice was smooth, deliberate. "We prepared because you wouldn't." The room seemed to contract around them, the walls no longer feeling as open, the high ceilings suddenly suffocating under the weight of unspoken failure. From the council seats, an avian-bodied diplomat, her plumage twitching with residual tension, shifted forward. Her sharp, reedy voice cut through the silence. "If you knew this was coming, why wait?" Voss' expression remained unreadable. "Because the Evok do not engage in war, they engage in annihilation. And if we had struck first, if we had moved without absolute proof, your council would have called it aggression." He met Mabek's burning gaze. "Wouldn't you?" A long, drawn-out moment passed. The Chancellor did not deny it. The weight of realization settled over them like a tide swallowing sand, pulling away the illusion of security they had wrapped themselves in. For the first time, the gathered species saw what had always been in front of them. Humanity had learned long ago that war was not about might. It was not about firepower. It was about control, about dictating the battlefield before the first shot was fired. Sorik Tal's jaw clenched. "And where are these forces now?" Voss tapped his wrist console. The projection shifted. New markers appeared across the galactic map, positioned with surgical intent. The Admiral inhaled sharply. "Already moving," Voss answered, watching as understanding crawled across his opponent's face. Dren Mabek, for all his hardened wisdom, hesitated. "How much time do we have?" Voss turned toward the central projection. The war had already begun. He knew exactly where the Evok fleet would break through first, the weaker outer colonies, the border settlements left vulnerable by the Council's failure to acknowledge the threat sooner. His next words were not a prediction, they were fact. "They'll hit Arrows 9 within 26 hours. The ripple of tension that swept through the chamber was visceral. No more denials, no more laughter. Dren Mabek exhaled, the sound a slow exodus of breath. "Then we don't have a choice." His golden eyes locked onto Voss. "You will advise our war council." Voss allowed a flicker of amusement to touch his features. "No," he said plainly. "I will command it." A beat. Mabek's gaze darkened, his pride grappling with pragmatism. The council had spent centuries dismissing Earth's methods as crude, unrefined, dangerous. Now their survival depended on those very methods. Sorik Tal's mandibles twitched, but he did not object. The silence stretched until it became a decision in itself. Dren Mabek nodded once, slowly, deliberately. Voss did not thank him. Instead, he turned toward the war map, eyes scanning the projections that had long since stopped being theoretical. The pieces were already in motion. The Evok believed themselves to be the unstoppable force, but they had walked straight into a battlefield they did not understand. They were already losing, they just didn't know it yet. Voss's gaze remained locked onto the war map, its projected light casting ghostly streaks across his face. The shifting markers, red for the Evok fleet, blue for Earth's forces, moved like predators circling unseen prey. The Council had spent centuries convincing themselves that war was a game of strength, that superior numbers and firepower determined victory. But wars weren't won by force. They were won before the first battle ever began. Dren Mabek's voice cut through the tension, weighted with reluctant authority. "We'll need immediate fleet coordination. Reinforcements are already in motion," Voss interrupted. His tone was even, but the words carried an edge that made Mabek pause. The council leader's molten gold eyes flickered with unreadable thought. "You've anticipated every move they'll make." It wasn't a question. Voss turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I don't anticipate, Chancellor." His fingers tapped a control node, shifting the war map forward in accelerated projection. I know. The council chamber darkened as the war map transformed, a living battlefield playing out in real time. The Yevok fleet, a serpentine mass of blackened warships, surged through the void, their movement unerring, predictable in their arrogance. They had never known defeat. They had never needed to adapt. They would learn soon enough. Sorik Tal's secondary arms twitched, his throat clicking in agitation. Explain this. Voss exhaled, slow and deliberate, before motioning to the highlighted blue markers. Humanity has been at war for longer than most civilizations have existed. We don't wait for enemies to come to us. We study them. We plant faults in their intelligence networks, distort their operational assessments, manipulate the way they think. The Yevok believe their advancement in energy-based shielding makes them invulnerable. They've seen your forces struggle against them, so they assume our response will be the same. A slow, calculating smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. They assume wrong. The projection zoomed in, human fleet formations deploying in irregular, shifting patterns, unlike the rigid, blocky lines of the Council's doctrine. Mavic frowned. Your ships are disorganized. Voss shook his head. They look disorganized. There's a difference. Before anyone could challenge him, the war map blinked red. Arrows 9. The Yevok had arrived. Dren Mavic inhaled sharply. Sorik Tal's mandibles flared, his instincts fighting against the logic Voss had forced upon him. Open a channel, Mavic ordered. The central display shifted, revealing the cold abyssal form of Supreme Warlord Tuk. His crimson exoskeleton gleamed beneath the eerie half-light of his warship's bridge, his slit-pupilled eyes gleaming with predatory amusement. The Yevok leader was motionless, save for the slow, deliberate tapping of clawed fingers against the arm of his command throne. I expected fear, Tuk mused, his voice carrying the kind of confidence born from centuries of unchallenged conquest. Yet all I hear is silence. Voss stepped forward before Mavic could respond. No, he said, voice steady. You hear calculation. For the first time, something in Tuk's gaze shifted. A minuscule pause, a flicker of something unreadable. It was brief, a fraction of hesitation, but it was there. Voss pressed the advantage. You think this war is already won, he continued, letting the words sink in, letting them fester like an unrecognized wound. You assume our tactics will mirror those of the Council, that will scramble to form defensive lines, that will fight on your terms. He let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. We don't fight like you. We fight to win. Tuk's head tilted, slow and deliberate, his claws ceasing their rhythmic tapping. Then he leaned forward. Bold words for a species that has yet to prove itself. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then watch. The war map shifted again, real-time battle footage overlaying its projection. The Yevok fleet had expected resistance at Arrows 9, a desperate attempt at defense. What they found instead was silence. No warships, no planetary defenses activated, no immediate response. Confusion rippled through their formations. The Yevok fleet slowed, scanning for unseen threats. Their commanders assumed a trap, but they were looking in the wrong place. They were looking outward. They should have been looking inward. In the next moment, entire sections of their formation collapsed. Tuk's expression didn't change, but Voss saw the flicker of unease ripple across his posture. The Yevok fleet, perfectly coordinated, disciplined beyond measure, had fractured. Because they weren't just being attacked, they were being rewritten. Humanity had never intended to meet the Yevok head-on. They had infiltrated their war protocols, their communication relays, their tactical response systems. Every unit now operated on false intelligence. Every counterattack was aimed at positions that weren't there. The Yevok weren't fighting an enemy. They were fighting phantoms. Dren Mavic's breath came slower, his mind processing what he was witnessing. You sabotaged them before the battle even began. Voss inclined his head slightly. We made them predictable, he corrected. Then we let them destroy themselves. On the screen, a massive Yevok dreadnought fired its main battery at a human warship. The warship wasn't there. Its ghost signature flickered, a manufactured echo in the enemy's targeting array. The Yevok's own shot tore through their own advancing formation. Tuk's jaw tightened, his claws digging into the armrest of his throne. Voss watched him, observed the minute shift in his breathing, the barely perceptible flick of his gaze toward his command console. He was starting to understand. Not that it would save him. Tuk exhaled once, sharp and even. "Impressive," he admitted. "But tricks do not win wars." Voss folded his arms. "No, but they end them." Another ripple in the war. The Yevok formations continued to collapse inward, crushing themselves under the weight of miscalculation. Tuk's expression darkened. The predator had finally recognized the presence of another predator. "I see now," he murmured. "You fight like cowards." Voss smiled. "No, we fight to survive." Tuk's form blinked out as the transmission cut. Tal exhaled, low and measured, for the first time unable to hide his admiration. "You're dismantling them." Voss didn't look away from the war map. "No," he corrected. "I'm making them desperate." He tapped the console once. The projection zoomed in, revealing the next phase. The trap was set. The Yevok, for the first time in their history, would be forced to fight a war they did not understand, and humanity would be waiting. A silence stretched across the war room, taut as a wire pulled to breaking. Every eye remained locked on the war map, where the Yevok formations were twisting inward, turning their fire upon phantom enemies, breaking against unseen traps. A masterpiece of engineered failure. Voss didn't celebrate. Not yet. Across from him, Chancellor Dren Mavik's fingers had gone still, interlocked before him like the final remains of a shattered structure barely holding shape. His molten gaze flickered between Voss and the display, each second stretching, thick with the weight of realization. "You said you were making them desperate," Mavik murmured, his voice carrying a careful, measured restraint. "What happens when a desperate enemy has nothing left to lose?" Voss met his gaze, unreadable. "We find out." The war map blinked red. The Yevok shifted, not from collapse, but from calculation. Their fragmented fleet, once tangled in deception, suddenly pivoted, abandoning all defensive formations. Frigates accelerated recklessly into battle lines. Dreadnoughts pushed forward with no concern for coordination. A shift from strategic assault to complete, unrelenting offense. Tuk had stopped playing the game. He was coming straight for the throat. Tal's mandibles twitched, his primary hands clenching at his sides. "They're not retreating," he muttered, the edge of unease sharpening his voice. "They're pushing forward." Voss tilted his head slightly, watching the unfolding chaos as the Yevok plunged straight into the firestorm they had spent the last cycle creating. "They're betting everything on brute force," he said, more to himself than anyone else. His eyes flickered over the new formations, absorbing the angles, the distortions, the patterns forming within the disorder. No, not disorder. A feint within a feint. Tuk was doing exactly what Voss had done to him. Mavik straightened, his expression shifting, sensing the turn. "Ambassador." Voss exhaled through his nose. "He's adapting." The word carried a weight the council had never considered before. Tuk wasn't like them. He wasn't a creature of doctrine, of war fought within the margins of expectation. The Yevok had never needed to evolve, until now. And now they were learning. A sharp trill broke through the chamber as an incoming report overlaid the war map. The Yevok vanguard was cutting through human flanking squadrons with brutal efficiency. Unburdened by defensive protocols, their ships became weapons of pure momentum, battering through kill zones, crashing through fire support lines. Tuk was throwing bodies into the fire, making the same gambit Voss had shown him, but faster, more ruthlessly. The war map flashed another warning. A human battle group, Task Force Epsilon, had just been obliterated. Voss didn't flinch. He had expected casualties, but this was something else. The Yevok weren't just fighting back, they were copying him. Admiral Lorne Kess's voice came through the intercom, steady but lined with something tight beneath the surface. "Voss," he said, clipped. "Your plan's unraveling. They're cutting through faster than projections." Voss scanned the battle reports, his mind working in overdrive, calculating the next 20 moves before the first could be executed. The battlefield was shifting, no longer a slow, methodical dissection. This had become a brawl, and brawls had no guarantees. Tal stepped closer to the projection, the amber glow of the war map reflecting against the ridges of his carapace. "Tell me, Ambassador," he said, low and thoughtful, What happens when an enemy you underestimated learns how to kill you better? The weight of the question settled over the room like an iron press, because the answer wasn't one the council wanted to hear. For the first time, Voss had no immediate response. The silence thickened, then another report. Multiple human vessels lost in quick succession. The Yivok advance had found its opening, and if Voss didn't act now, the entire plan would collapse. He exhaled, grounding himself. The game had changed. That meant the board had to change with it. Fine, if Tuk wanted a brawl, then he'd give him one. Voss' voice was calm when he spoke, yet it carried through the chamber with the authority of a closing steel door. All forward strike groups, order a full reversal. A pause. Confusion rippled through the war room. Even Kess hesitated on the comm line. Say again. You heard me. Voss turned to face the projection. Hold them back. Mavik's brow lifted. You're abandoning position. No. Voss watched the map tracking the momentum, the inertia of a force suddenly deprived of its expected resistance. I'm pulling them into the trap they don't see yet. The order relayed. Human ships began disengaging, peeling away in synchronized retreat. The Yivok pressed harder, emboldened by what they thought was a rout. They had no idea what was waiting for them. A shift flickered across the war map, subtle but undeniable. The Yivok had overcommitted. Their formation stretched thin, their pursuit turning reckless. Voss leaned in slightly, observing the exact moment they lost control. Now, he said, collapse the net, and it happened. The human fleet pivoted, not into defense but into counter-encirclement. The Yivok had pushed too far. They had charged into what they thought was a weakening enemy, only to find themselves surrounded on all sides. Lorne Kess's laughter filtered through the comms. You sneaky bastard. Voss exhaled slowly, watching the numbers change, watching the battle shift back into their hands. Sorik Tal studied him for a long moment, then let out a breath of his own. That was well played. Whole beat. Though I wonder, will it be enough? Voss didn't answer. Not yet, because he had felt it. The moment Tuk realized what had happened. Not panic, not rage. Something else, not defeat, recognition, and that more than anything else, unsettled Voss, because it meant this wasn't the end. It meant Tuk had already planned for the next move, and whatever it was, Voss wasn't sure anyone was ready for it. Voss watched the war map flicker, the red tide of the Yivok fleet constricting within the snare they had blindly charged into. He could almost feel the weight of their realization, a force once unstoppable now entangled in its own momentum, trapped in a battlefield it no longer understood. Lorne Kess's voice crackled through the comms, lined with something just shy of satisfaction. We've got them boxed in. No. Voss didn't look away from the projection, the lines of engagement shifting like a blade being drawn across skin. Not yet, because Tuk wasn't done. The Supreme Warlord had recognized the trap, and instead of retreating, he was solidifying. The Yivok weren't panicking. They were holding. Mavik's voice was steady, but the undertone of tension remained. Why haven't they broken? Voss's jaw set, scanning the fractured formations. The way the Yivok moved, not scrambling, not disorderly, but folding inward, tightening into a brutal, unyielding core. They weren't collapsing. They were adapting. And then it came, the shift. The Yivok, outnumbered, surrounded, stopped maneuvering defensively, their fleet lines pushed outward, breaking apart, scattering into unpredictable vectors. Tuk had turned the battlefield into something else. He had turned it into a knife fight. Kess's voice was sharper now. They're coming at us in fragments. It's not formation-based. It's Voss finished for him. Tactical chaos. Tuk had learned the lesson humanity had been teaching, the power of unpredictability. He had abandoned order and turned the war into a street fight, knowing that for every ship lost, another could slip through, deal damage, create fractures in the carefully laid human web. It was a different kind of war now, one where raw instinct, not strategy, would determine the outcome. And for the first time, Voss saw it, the thing that had been building from the moment the Yivok had realized they were losing. Tuk wasn't just adapting, he was playing for something bigger. Lorne Kess cursed. They're hitting us in close quarters, too fast for counter-battery fire. We can't outmaneuver all of them. Voss acted before the words were fully spoken. Full fleet disengagement, he ordered. Silence crashed into the war room. Sorik Tal took a step forward, his frame casting a jagged shadow across the console's glow. "You're calling a retreat?" Voss's expression didn't shift. "No, I'm resetting the board." Tuk had tilted the game sideways. He had thrown everything into this moment, forcing humanity into a brutal engagement, betting on exhaustion, on the chaos breaking their rhythm. But he had miscalculated something critical. Humans didn't fight on instinct. They forced instinct onto the enemy. And if Tuk wanted chaos, Voss would give him something worse: nothing. Mavik's brow knit in rare confusion. "You're pulling them back." "What are you?" Voss's fingers danced over the console, sending new coordinates, forcing every human battle group to withdraw. Not in panic, not in disorder, in calculated silence. The battle began to unravel on both sides. Tuk's forces, primed for unrelenting close-quarters combat, suddenly found themselves with no targets. The chaos he had tried to unleash was swallowed by a vacuum, and in that vacuum, something more terrifying took shape. Stillness. The Yivok had thrown themselves into a knife fight, but now they were standing alone, blades drawn, with no one to cut. The silence stretched. Then one by one the Yivok ships began overextending. They had charged too hard, spent too much. Their momentum, their formations, designed for overwhelming, unrelenting force, now had nothing left to break against. Voss whispered into the open channel. "Now," and humanity came back, not as a force of war, but as executioners. The Yivok, their ships thrown too far, their fuel reserves drained from prolonged engagement, had nothing left to counter with. Humanity didn't fight chaos. They let it burn itself out, and then they cleaned up the remains. One by one, Yivok ships fell under precision strikes, their movements sluggish, their patterns unraveled. Their own gamble had become a noose, and at the center of it all, Tuk's command ship remained, watching, waiting. For the first time in his entire reign, Tuk had no move left to play. Voss inhaled. Then he opened the direct channel. Tuk's image materialized, but the arrogance was gone, not replaced by fear, but by something else. Something colder, understanding. Voss studied him for a long moment, then spoke. "Now do you see?" Tuk's claws tapped against the armrest of his command throne. Slow, thoughtful. "Decision, you were right." His voice was no longer dismissive, no longer amused. "War isn't about strength." Voss tilted his head. "No, it's about control." The words lingered, stretched between them, weighted with something final. Tuk exhaled, the motion one of recognition, not defeat. "And you were always in control." Voss said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The war was over. The Yivok fleet crumbled. The last holdouts surrendered, knowing what awaited them if they refused. Tuk's image faded from the display. Surik Tal exhaled slowly. "You dismantled them." Voss looked at him, expression unreadable. "No, I taught them." Because now Tuk understood. He understood what war truly was, and that understanding would haunt the Yivok for generations. Dren Mavik turned toward Voss, his gaze unreadable. "You forced us to see what we never wanted to." Voss met his gaze, unblinking. "You mocked us because you thought war was about brute force, about conquest, about victory." He gestured toward the empty battlefield. "You never understood that war is not about winning." The silence wrapped around the room like a closing fist. "It's about making sure you never have to fight again." The words hit with the weight of history itself, because that was the lesson, that was what they had refused to see. Humanity had never fought for glory, never fought for conquest. They fought to end wars before they ever began. Mavik inhaled, his jaw tight. "What will you do now?" Voss stepped back from the console, adjusting his jacket. "We'll prepare." Mavik frowned. "For what?" Voss turned, meeting his gaze one last time. "For the next species that makes the same mistake you did." And with that he walked away. The Council never mocked humanity's war history again.